Between 1847 and 1852, three prominent plantation families in the Tennessee River Valley of northern Alabama suffered complete ruin through circumstances so disturbing that local newspapers refused to print the full accounts. 23 people died across these estates, some from fever, others from accidents that defied explanation, and several under conditions the county coroner described only as unnatural cessation of vital functions. The common thread binding these tragedies remained hidden in ledgers, letters, and testimonies the judges ordered sealed for over a century. Dumb. At the center of every catastrophe stood one woman whose name appeared in ownership papers, household inventories, and eventually criminal proceedings, yet whose true story was deliberately obscured by families desperate to protect their reputations, and a legal system unwilling to confront and what her existence revealed about the foundations of Southern society. This is the story of Rachel, a woman whose intelligence and determination would expose the darkest contradictions of Antebellum Alabama, and whose methods of resistance were so sophisticated that the legal system had no framework to prosecute her. Because Rachel had discovered something terrifying to slaveholders. She realized that in a society built on the lie that enslaved people were mentally inferior, a woman of superior intelligence could destroy her oppressors completely while remaining legally untouchable. Limestone County in northern Alabama had prospered through the 1840s on cotton cultivation, with the Tennessee River providing convenient transport to markets in New Orleans. Three families dominated the social landscape of the county's eastern townships. The Rutledge family owned Fairmont, a 2,400-acre plantation worked by 87 enslaved people. Samuel Rutledge had arrived from South Carolina in 1838 with family money and connections to the state legislature. His wife Catherine came from Virginia with pretensions to aristocracy. Their household included 3 children, 2 sons at university and a daughter Lydia, 19 years old and attracting attention from neighboring planters' sons. 5 miles upriver, James Haverhill maintained Riverside, a slightly smaller but more modern establishment. He was 43, served as county magistrate, and had political ambitions requiring careful management of his reputation. The third family, the Crenshaw household at Oak Ridge, operated with less pretense but greater efficiency. Daniel Crenshaw, a widower of 51, ran his 1,800 acres with meticulous attention to profit margins. In April 1847, Samuel Rutledge traveled to Mobile and stopped at an estate sale. Among the items being liquidated were 37 enslaved people. One caught his attention, a woman listed as Rachel, approximately 24 years old, described as house-trained, literate, accomplished in needlework and music, fluent in French and English. The listing noted her sale was by special decree and included an unusual stipulation that the purchaser must take her at least 100 miles from Mobile. The price was remarkably low, $400 when skilled house servants typically commanded $1,200 or more. Rutledge's interest was practical. His wife needed someone capable of training their daughter in social accomplishments. The low price and distance requirements suggested complications, but the auction agent assured him it was merely an estate technicality. Rutledge purchased Rachel and arranged transport to Limestone County. When Rachel arrived at Fairmont 3 weeks later, Catherine expressed satisfaction. Rachel was tall with light brown skin and carried herself with unusual composure. She spoke with appropriate deference and demonstrated immediate competence. Catherine assigned her to work with Lydia, teaching French conversation and needlework refinement. For 6 weeks, everything proceeded smoothly. In that regard, we are not so different, you and I. Over following weeks, Rachel built Lydia's sense of injustice while offering sympathetic understanding. She encouraged journal keeping, suggested Lydia had rights transcending her father's authority, painted pictures of women making their own choices. What Rachel was doing was creating ideological justification for rebellion. By September, Samuel's arrangement with Haverhill showed strain. The factoring scheme required more capital than projected, and Haverhill's resentment made him uncooperative. Rachel approached Samuel with new intelligence that Haverhill was speaking privately about Samuel's gambling debts and questionable practices. He means to ruin you, sir. He seeks ways to damage your reputation so he might withdraw without appearing dishonorable. Samuel's rage was immediate. He confronted Haverhill publicly at the Agricultural Society meeting. The confrontation became scandal. Rachel had achieved exactly what she intended, conflict that would consume both families. On September 18, 1847, Lydia disappeared from Fairmont. She left a note about rejecting her father's plans and seeking a life of her own choosing. The plantation erupted into chaos. Samuel organized searches. Catherine collapsed with nervous exhaustion. Every enslaved person was questioned, some beaten. Rachel expressed appropriate shock and grief, claiming no knowledge of Lydia's plans. She appeared genuinely distressed, weeping convincingly. The truth was darker. Lydia hadn't left entirely of her own accord. Rachel had spent months preparing her psychologically, then arranged her departure through contacts in the clandestine network of free blacks and escaped slaves. Lydia believed she was asserting independence. In reality, she'd been manipulated into an action that would destroy her family's standing. In late September, Daniel Crenshaw, who had met Rachel at an August social event and been impressed with her intelligence and bearing, approached Samuel with an offer to purchase her. Samuel, desperate for capital to fund the search and increasingly paranoid, agreed to the sale. Rachel was transferred to Oak Ridge for $900, more than twice what Samuel paid. Rachel departed Fairmont on October 3, 1847. Behind her, she left a family in ruins. Lydia missing, Samuel's arrangements collapsing, Catherine's health broken, the household's reputation destroyed. Bess, the cook, stood at the kitchen door and made the sign against evil. "Lord, have mercy on the Crenshaw family," she whispered. "That woman carries destruction like a plague." Fark. Daniel Crenshaw's Oak Ridge operated with austere efficiency. Rachel recognized immediately that Oak Ridge presented different challenges. Daniel wasn't easily manipulated by refined accomplishments or feminine charm. He valued practical competence. Rachel adapted. She became indispensable through quiet efficiency, managing accounts with meticulous accuracy, identifying expense reductions, demonstrating understanding of agricultural economics. Within weeks, Daniel found himself consulting her on matters beyond household management. This troubled Margaret, Daniel's daughter, who'd managed the household since her mother's death, and who resented displacement by a new servant. Margaret was intelligent and practical like her father, but she also possessed something others lacked. Suspicion of Rachel's too. Perfect competence. "Father, do you not find it strange," Margaret said one November evening, "that this woman possesses education far exceeding what one would expect from someone sold at such low price?" The Rutledge catastrophe began shortly after they acquired her. Perhaps that is coincidence, but perhaps not. Daniel dismissed his daughter's concerns. The Rutledge catastrophe resulted from Samuel's poor business practices. Rachel has been nothing but an asset. Margaret said nothing further, but began watching Rachel closely. What Margaret couldn't know was that Rachel's strategy for this family required more patience and different techniques. By early December, Rachel had found what she needed in the plantation's financial records. Daniel had been borrowing small amounts regularly, patterns suggesting ongoing financial pressure despite apparent profitability. She discovered he was attempting to purchase additional bottomland that would nearly double Oak Ridge's size but required capital he didn't possess. In mid-January 1849, James Haverhill, whose business had collapsed after the failed Rutledge partnership, approached Daniel with a factoring partnership proposal. Rachel was present when Haverhill visited, serving refreshments and appearing inattentive, but she listened carefully. After Haverhill departed, Rachel found opportunity to speak privately with Daniel, expressing concern about Haverhill's reputation. "Sir, I don't presume to involve myself, but when I served at Fairmont, I learned that Mr. Haverhill destroyed Mr. Rutledge through deliberate manipulation and false dealing. This was complete reversal of the story she'd told Samuel months earlier." The contradiction didn't matter because the two men couldn't compare notes. Daniel ultimately rejected Haverhill's proposal. Rachel had now engineered three-way hostility between the county's most prominent families. But the actual destruction Rachel planned required one more element: exploitation of a secret involving William Crenshaw and a relationship he'd been concealing. William had formed attachment to Anna Pritchard, daughter of an Athens shopkeeper, far beneath the social station Daniel expected. Rachel learned of this through her network among enslaved people. In February, Rachel arranged for Daniel to discover his son's secret in the most damaging way. She ensured a letter from Anna to William was delivered when Daniel was present, and William was not. Daniel's rage was immediate. That evening, when William returned and revealed he'd already married Anna weeks earlier and she was pregnant, Daniel responded by disinheriting his son and ordering him to leave immediately. The Crenshaw family was now fractured. External pressure arrived in March 1849 when a man named Josiah Fletcher appeared claiming to represent New Orleans creditors, holding notes on Crenshaw's concealed borrowing. Fletcher demanded immediate payment of $8,000. Fletcher's arrival wasn't coincidence. Rachel had arranged it through her network, providing intelligence about Crenshaw's debts to people who could exploit it. Daniel, facing financial ruin and family collapse simultaneously, made a catastrophic decision. He would pay the debt by selling a significant portion of his enslaved workforce, 20 people, including families who'd worked at Oak Ridge for over a decade. The sale took place March 28, 1849, conducted rapidly, without regard for keeping families together. Rachel observed with no visible emotion. She'd caused this deliberately, understanding the human cost. 20 lives destroyed to serve her larger purpose. Margaret was present at the auction, and for the first time saw Rachel's face slip momentarily, revealing not emotion, but calculation. Margaret recognized that Rachel had orchestrated everything. That evening, Margaret confronted Rachel directly. "You did this. My father's troubles, William's exposure. All of it." Rachel met her gaze without flinching. "Miss Margaret, I'm a piece of property. I have no power to arrange anything. Your family's troubles come from your father's decisions. You're a liar and a manipulator. I will prove what you've done, and when I do, you will hang for it." Rachel smiled briefly. "To prove that, Miss Margaret, you would need to acknowledge that an enslaved woman outwitted 3 prominent planter families. You would need to admit your father was manipulated by his property." "Do you really believe your pride would allow such admission?" Margaret had no answer because Rachel was correct. By mid-1849, James Haverhill's situation had deteriorated to desperation. In June, Edmund Fairbanks, a cotton factor from Mobile, expressed interest in forming partnerships with local planters. Haverhill saw salvation and negotiations proceeded well. This was a lie, but Samuel believed it. Rachel suggested that if someone helped her escape to a free state, she could build a new life. Samuel, driven by love and idealism, agreed to help and began making arrangements. On November 3, 1849, Rachel betrayed Samuel completely. She informed Daniel of his son's plans, presenting herself as loyal servant who'd uncovered a plot that would destroy the family's remaining honor. She provided Daniel with letters Samuel had written, evidence of his intended crimes. Daniel's response was to have Samuel committed to a private asylum near Tuscaloosa on grounds his son had become mentally unstable. Then, finally recognizing Rachel as the threat Margaret had warned about, Daniel arranged for her immediate sale to a slave trader who would transport her to Deep South cotton districts. The sale took place November 8th. Rachel was chained and placed in a coffle with 15 others being transported to Mississippi. As she departed Oak Ridge, she looked back at the Crenshaw family and spoke one sentence before the wagon carried her away. "Everything I did, you made necessary." The first death occurred November 23, 1849, exactly 15 days after Rachel's departure. James Haverhill was found dead in his study at Riverside, apparent victim of self-inflicted gunshot. Circumstances suggested suicide, but his wife Margaret immediately challenged the explanation. She insisted James would never have taken his own life. She hired a private investigator from Huntsville, former Pinkerton agent Abraham Cornwall, and directed him to examine the entire pattern of disasters afflicting 3 families. Cornwall's December report was damning in conclusions but frustrating in legal implications. The woman called Rachel has systematically destroyed multiple families through psychological manipulation and strategic provision of damaging intelligence. However, she has committed no acts that Alabama law recognizes as crimes. While Margaret Haverhill fought her legal battle, the Crenshaw family struggled with their own crisis. Samuel remained confined to the asylum where doctors reported he'd become withdrawn and uncommunicative. On January 17, 1850, Daniel Crenshaw was found dead in the cotton gin house at Oak Ridge. The machinery had apparently activated while he was inside conducting maintenance, crushing him. The death was ruled accidental, but Margaret Crenshaw knew immediately this was murder. Her father had been careful around machinery his entire life. Moreover, someone had been at Oak Ridge that day, a former field hand sold away months earlier, who'd returned claiming to deliver a message. Margaret reported suspicions to Yarborough, who investigated reluctantly, but found no evidence of tampering. The former field hand disappeared immediately. Cornwall traveled to Mississippi in February 1850 and located the plantation where Rachel had supposedly been taken. Then was sold again. Cornwall tracked her through 3 more transactions, always arriving weeks after she departed. Finally, in March 1850, Cornwall found her. She was now property of a planter in eastern Texas named Henry Dalton. Cornwall requested permission to interview the enslaved woman for Alabama legal proceedings. Dalton agreed. Cornwall's interview with Rachel lasted 2 hours. She answered every question, he wrote. She provided detailed accounts of her time with each family. She explained her methods with clinical precision. When I asked why she did these things, she said, because I could. Because they thought themselves superior in every way, but I was smarter than all of them. Because they bought and sold human beings while considering themselves civilized. And I wanted them to understand what it felt like to be destroyed by someone they considered beneath notice. Cornwall asked if she arranged the deaths. She smiled and said, Mr. Cornwall, I was hundreds of miles away when both men died. I sent no messages, gave no instructions, took no actions that could be considered criminal. If those men died, perhaps it was through consequences of their own actions. Or perhaps the people they enslaved found their own reasons to seek justice. You cannot prove I did anything because under your law, I can do nothing. I am property. Property has no agency. Property cannot commit crimes. Your legal system created this situation, and now you must live with it. Cornwall returned to Alabama in April 1850 with his report, but no prisoner. He presented findings to Judge Phelps and a special legislative committee. The legislators debated for 3 days about response. Some argued for new legislation. Others objected such laws would be impossible to enforce and create dangerous precedents, acknowledging slave agency. Debate was unresolved when the 3rd death occurred. On May 2, 1850, Samuel Crenshaw was found dead in his asylum room. He had apparently hanged himself using bed linens. Margaret Crenshaw received this news in a state beyond grief. Her father was dead, her brother William was estranged, and now Samuel had taken his own life. The Crenshaw family was effectively destroyed. In her grief and rage, Margaret made a decision. She would go to Texas herself, find Rachel, and kill her personally. Margaret departed for Texas on May 15, 1850, carrying a loaded pistol. What she didn't know was that Rachel was no longer in Texas. She'd been sold again 2 weeks earlier to a planter in Louisiana, and the new owner was connected to the original French Creole family in Mobile that had owned Rachel before she began her methodical destruction of Southern planter families. Margaret arrived in eastern Texas in early June after a difficult 3-week journey. She went directly to Dalton's plantation. Rachel was gone. Dalton informed her coldly he'd sold the woman to a cotton factor from New Orleans after discovering she'd been systematically gathering information about his business affairs. Margaret traveled immediately to Louisiana and learned Rachel had been purchased for a client, a widow living near Lake Pontchartrain. The widow's name was Elise Delacroix, the remarried wife of Louis Delacroix. The circle was complete. Rachel had returned to the region where her pattern apparently began. Margaret traveled to the Delacroix estate on June 24th, demanding to see both Elise and Rachel. When Rachel entered, Margaret saw something unexpected, recognition and sadness in the woman's eyes. Miss Crenshaw, Rachel said quietly, I knew someone would eventually come. I did not know it would be you. What followed was a conversation lasting nearly 3 hours. Margaret demanded to know why Rachel had destroyed her family. Rachel's answer was comprehensive. Rachel had been free in Richmond, daughter of a free black craftsman and a Frenchwoman. She'd been educated in reading, writing, French needlework, and music. When Rachel was 16, her in a workshop accident. Within months, creditors claimed his estate and seized his property, including through manufactured documentation his wife and daughter, claiming they were enslaved people he'd been keeping illegally as free. I was not born to slavery, Rachel told them. I was not raised to accept it as natural. I was educated to think, to question, to understand I was a human being with rights and dignity. And then one day, because white men decided they could steal my freedom, I became property. Do you understand what that does to someone? She described years of rage that had to be concealed, gradual recognition that physical escape was unlikely, but other forms of resistance, were possible. No, I decided that if I could not be free, I would at least make them pay. I would show them that the people they considered property were capable of destroying them completely. She described her methods, observing families for months, learning secrets, identifying weaknesses, mapping relationships. The beauty of it, I never had to lie. Everything I told each family was true. I simply chose which truths to reveal. And when? Margaret interrupted, voice shaking. And the deaths? My father, James Haverhill. My brother, Samuel. Rachel was silent before answering. Your father's death was not my direct action, but it was my design. I arranged for information to reach certain people who had their own reasons to want him dead. I ensured his movements were predictable. Someone acted on that information. Haverhill was similar. I ensured his despair was complete. Whether he killed himself or was killed by another, the outcome was what I intended. Your brother, Samuel, was different. I did not intend his death. I broke him emotionally to protect myself from his foolish rescue attempt, but I did not mean for him to die. That was regrettable. The word regrettable sent Margaret into fury. She pulled the pistol, aiming it at Rachel. Neither woman moved. Rachel looked at Margaret with steady eyes. You will not shoot me, Miss Crenshaw, because if you do, you will never know the rest of the story. Elise provided explanation. My first husband was destroyed by this woman's actions between 1843 and 1846. When I learned she was being sold through New Orleans, I arranged to purchase her. I brought her here not to continue exploiting her labor, but to hear the full account of her actions. She has spent the past 3 weeks writing a confession, complete documentation of her methods, her philosophy, and her justification. Elise crossed to a desk and retrieved thick papers. This document is extraordinary. Miss Crenshaw. It is a meticulous account of how an enslaved woman systematically destroyed 6 prominent Southern families over a decade. It is also a devastating critique of slavery from someone who experienced both freedom and bondage. Margaret lowered her pistol slightly. Why would you want such a document? Because I needed to understand, Elise said. I concluded that slavery creates women like Rachel and then acts surprised when they use the only weapons available to them. Rachel spoke again. Miss Crenshaw, you came here to kill me. I will not stop you if you choose, but I ask you to consider, if you kill me, you prove the system works, that white people can destroy black people who threaten them. If you let me live, you prove something more disturbing, that you cannot stop someone like me, that your legal systems are vulnerable to intelligence they refuse to acknowledge, and that slavery contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Margaret stood with the pistol, facing the woman who destroyed her family, and recognized she was confronting something larger than personal revenge. Rachel was not just an individual criminal. She was demonstration of fundamental instability in the entire social order. She'd proven enslaved people could be more intelligent than their owners, could manipulate the supposedly superior white race, could exact revenge that no law could prevent. Margaret lowered the pistol completely. I will not kill you, but neither will I leave you unpunished. I will take your confession to the Alabama legislature and to newspapers throughout the South. Rachel met her gaze steadily. That is your right, Miss Crenshaw. But consider, if you publicize my methods, you also publicize my humanity, my intelligence, and my moral critique of the system that enslaved me. You prove we are not the childlike innocents or savage brutes your society claims. You demonstrate we are fully human, capable of sophisticated thought and strategic action. That proof may be more dangerous to slavery than any violence I could commit. The Alabama legislature created new statutes in 1851, addressing crimes by enslaved people involving psychological manipulation. But these laws were vague, difficult to enforce, and ultimately ineffective because the fundamental contradiction remained. Admitting enslaved people could commit sophisticated crimes required acknowledging their intelligence and agency, which undermined slavery's entire ideological foundation. Rachel herself disappeared from historical records after 1851. Whether she remained with Elise, was sold again, escaped to freedom, or died, none can be determined from available documents. Margaret Crenshaw never married. She devoted remaining years to managing what was left of the estate and to private obsession with documenting what Rachel had done. In 1867, after the war ended slavery, Margaret wrote in her journal, I have spent 16 years trying to comprehend that woman, I understand her methods now and her motivation. What I cannot reconcile is that I find myself almost admiring her even as I hate her for what she did to my family. She was an enemy of great intelligence and determination, and she won our war completely. One passage from Rachel's confession appears repeatedly in historical works. Her explanation of why she chose psychological manipulation rather than physical violence. I could have killed individual owners with poison or in their sleep. Many enslaved people have done so and been caught and executed. But individual murders change nothing. They are replaced by new owners, and the system continues. I chose instead to destroy families completely and visibly, to demonstrate that intelligence is a weapon more powerful than violence, and to prove that the people white society considers property are capable of sophisticated resistance that their laws cannot address. I wanted them to fear our minds more than our hands, because they can chain hands but they cannot chain thought. This is the story of Rachel, the most dangerous woman in Alabama, whose weapon was her mind, and whose battlefield was the psychological vulnerabilities of the families who claimed to own her. She proved that the greatest threat to slavery wasn't physical rebellion, but intellectual resistance that the system had no way to combat, because acknowledging it required admitting the fundamental lie upon which slavery was built.